This feels like the baby steps towards eventually what we hope to see is, of course, the full reopening of Chinese borders.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the border regime is one area in which they haven't moved quite quickly. Everything else, when it comes to the easing of the COVID-0 regime, has been much quicker than many China watchers have anticipated, and that might be wise, realistically, when you think about it. Very focused on the internal situation while keeping that quarantine system effectively intact. So this report suggests that they will be willing, at least with that border with Hong Kong, to start to ease there coming into January, ahead of the Lunar New Year holidays, of course.
Emma, we are seeing now the spread of infections across China with these easing restrictions. What are we hearing from hospitals and just a broader healthcare system in the mainland?
Well, it does appear as though COVID is spreading very, very widely and quite fast. I think, I mean, just anecdotally, faster than I've seen it spread anywhere, really. And there's some speculation as to why that is. The vaccination program was administered quite some time ago in China. There's obviously, a lot of density in a place like Beijing, so it could be spreading quite effectively there. And what we are seeing is quite a lot of pressure on hospitals. People are inured in China, particularly in Beijing, to going to the hospital when they have a fever. So there's a lot of communication from the government trying to deter people from lining up at hospitals, from lining up at fever clinics, to stay home and treat themselves. But that's not being hugely effective. We're hearing about doctors that are overwhelmed in Beijing, the capital, where it is flaring quite significantly right now, being called in even if they have COVID symptoms. So not looking very good in Beijing, and potentially a real illustration for how this wave could play out in China as they move quite rapidly toward reopening.
We also heard from the Chinese ambassador to the US, really again addressing this idea that we will see the resumption of cross-border travel, and soon, and international travel, not just necessarily between Hong Kong and China.
Yeah, I mean, I think they are definitely turning the page. They're moving toward rejoining the world, accepting COVID as something that is a reality. But before we get to that normality, before we get to that point where they're in a situation like the rest of the world is, they have to go through a pretty brutal and large COVID wave on an under-vaccinated population, particularly the elderly. So it's going to be a bumpy ride until we get to the point where Chinese tourists are travelling again, where they're providing that stimulus to the global economy again via their travel and tourism.
Just quickly, do we know if there is a vaccine target? Because as we know here in Australia, for example, 90%, that was always the goal for a reopening. Do we know what that schedule looks like for China?
No, they haven't set a specific target, and they have been reluctant to give mandates, force particularly the older people, which are significantly under-vaccinated in China compared to the rest of the world. I mean, the overall vaccination rate is okay, but boosters have not been taken up as widely as they have been in other places. So you've got people who may have had their second shot a year ago, now getting COVID and getting it quite quickly. So, yeah, it's not an ideal vaccination situation in China there.